In a fractured America teetering on the edge of collapse, chaos has become the new order. RABID States plunges listeners into a dystopian landscape where political upheaval, economic decay, and rampant fear have set society ablaze. Amid violent uprisings and collapsing institutions, a disparate group of survivors, each wrestling with personal loss and hardened by despair, must navigate a perilous new reality. As they battle both external threats and the inner demons of a society gone mad, they uncover glimmers of hope and the resilience of the human spirit, challenging the notion that humanity is doomed to self-destruction. The last American flag burns, slowly atop what was once the Lincoln Memorial, its embers carried away by an acrid wind. Below, a woman in her 50s, face weathered not just by age but by a world unraveled, traces the outline of Lincoln's shattered face in the rubble. Her fingers, calloused from survival, remember a different touch, the smooth marble from school. Trips decades ago, when America still stood for something, she places a faded photograph against the stone, her family smiling from before. A promise to the dead. A reminder of why she still fights in a nation where neighbors turned on neighbors, where states declared themselves sovereign, where rabid ideology devoured reason. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Eleanor Reeves never thought she'd be the last one standing. At 57, with salt and pepper hair tied back in a practical braid and eyes that had witnessed too much, she had outlived her husband, her daughter, and the country she served as a history professor. Now, those history lessons played out in real time across what people called the RABID States, fractured territories where ideology trumped humanity. Dawn broke over the ruins of Washington, D.C., as Eleanor navigated familiar streets made foreign by destruction. 3 years since the collapse. That's what survivors called the 6-month period when everything fell apart. First the grid failures during that scorching summer, then the supply chain breakdown, followed by the economic implosion that wiped out savings and security. By winter, when the National Guard couldn't contain the spreading violence, the federal government had effectively dissolved, with states declaring emergency powers and borders closing. Eleanor adjusted her backpack, the weight of survival pressing down on her shoulders. Inside, water purification tablets, antibiotic ointment, half a bottle of painkillers, ammunition, and the journal she'd kept since the beginning. Documenting history remained her purpose, even as history itself unraveled. The Capitol dome rose in the distance, partially collapsed on its eastern side. Eleanor remembered teaching her students about its construction during the Civil War, how Lincoln had insisted on completing it to show that the Union would endure. Now, its broken silhouette stood as a monument to different lessons. "You shouldn't be out alone, Professor," came a familiar voice. Eleanor turned to see Marcus Hale emerging from the shadow of an overturned bus. At 35, the former Marine carried himself with the vigilant posture of someone who never fully came home from war, even before this new one began. His dark skin was weathered by outdoor living, and a jagged scar ran from his left temple to his jawline, a souvenir from the Connecticut border clashes. "I'm documenting the legislative quarter," Eleanor replied, holding up her journal. "Besides, I thought our meeting wasn't until noon." Marcus fell into step beside her. "Plans change." Riley picked up chatter on the radio. "Red Brigade patrols are expanding their territory. We need to move our camp," Eleanor sighed. The Red Brigade, one of the many ideological militias that had filled the power vacuum. This particular group claimed to be restoring traditional American values while executing anyone who disagreed with their interpretation of tradition. "What about the others?" she asked. Waiting at the rendezvous point, Zoe managed to salvage medicine from that pharmacy on K Street. "David's got the truck running again." Eleanor nodded, a small relief. Their group had formed organically over the past 2 years. Marcus, the reluctant leader, Zoe Chen, a nurse practitioner who'd lost her hospital in the first wave of bombings, David Alvarez, a mechanic whose engineering skills kept them mobile, Riley Cooper, a 19-year-old tech prodigy who maintained their communications, and Samir Nadim, an immigrant grocery store owner who'd become their resource finder. 6 strangers unified by the simple desire to survive without surrendering. Their humanity. We should cut through the museum district, Eleanor suggested. The brigade avoids it because of the collapse risk. Marcus considered this, then nodded. Lead the way, Professor. The Smithsonian complex stood in eerie silence, its treasures either looted or abandoned. Eleanor remembered bringing her daughter Hannah here when she was 10. The memory stabbed at her, Hannah's wonder at the moon rock, her laughter echoing through the Air and Space Museum. Hannah would be 32 now, if she'd survived the brutal Boston quarantine. You're thinking about her again, Marcus said quietly. Eleanor didn't deny it. Today would have been her birthday. Marcus placed a hand briefly on her shoulder, a rare gesture from someone who maintained careful physical boundaries. She'd be proud, Eleanor. You're preserving what matters. They navigated around the Natural History Museum, its grand entrance partially blocked by a military transport vehicle. The corpse of its driver had long since been reduced to bones in tattered uniform. Remember when we fought over whether dinosaurs had feathers? Eleanor said, nodding toward the museum. Seems absurd now. The things we argued about before, Marcus agreed with a grim smile. Political correctness, cancel culture, who could use which bathroom. While the real threats gathered strength, Eleanor finished. Climate disasters, wealth inequality, information warfare. You sound like your old lectures are still running in your head. They are. I keep thinking if we'd understood our history better, we might have recognized the patterns. They fell silent as they approached Constitution Avenue. Once a proud thoroughfare, it now served as a dividing line between territories claimed by rival factions. The eastern side belonged to the progressives, a coalition of former government workers, academics, and urban survivors who maintained a fragile democracy within their boundaries. The western portion had fallen under the control of the New Federalists, who preached states' rights while enforcing harsh religious doctrine. Between these larger territories roamed smaller groups, opportunistic gangs, traumatized survivors banded together for protection, and the truly dangerous zealots who believed the collapse was divine punishment. Eleanor and Marcus ducked into an alleyway as an armed patrol approached, their mismatched body armor and red armbands marking them as brigade soldiers. They're expanding their patrols, Marcus whispered, getting bolder. Eleanor nodded, her heart pounding as the patrol passed. When they emerged from hiding, they moved with greater urgency toward the rendezvous point, the underground parking garage of what had once been a luxury hotel. The descent into darkness always unsettled Eleanor, but the familiar voices waiting below calmed her nerves. Finally, Zoe's precise clinical tone echoed through the concrete space. At 43, the former nurse practitioner had developed a brusque efficiency that masked deep compassion. Her straight black hair was cropped short for practicality, and her slim build belied remarkable endurance. We've been ready to move for an hour. Blame the professor's detours, Marcus replied, but his tone held no accusation. David Alvarez looked up from the engine of their salvage delivery truck, his hands black with grease. At 48, he carried the solid build of someone who'd spent his life in physical labor. His salt and pepper beard obscured half his face, but couldn't hide the perpetual worry in his eyes, a father who hadn't heard from his children in California since the networks went down. She gets the scenic route. I get to smell like gasoline, he quipped, wiping his hands on a rag. Truck's good for another 100 miles, but we need to find diesel soon. Riley Cooper sat cross-legged on the hood, her laptop connected to a makeshift antenna. The youngest of their group at 19, she'd been a freshman computer science major when her university became a battlefield. Her red hair was pulled back in a ponytail, and freckles stood out against pale skin that rarely saw sunlight. "I've been monitoring brigade communications," she reported. "They're planning something big. Multiple patrols converging northwest of here." "What's northwest of here?" Eleanor asked, pulling out her hand-drawn map. "The Last Harvest community," Samir answered, emerging from behind a concrete pillar. At 52, the former store owner had transformed from a slightly overweight suburban father to a lean, resourceful survivor. His accent still carried traces of his native Mumbai, though he'd been an American citizen for 20 years before citizenship ceased to matter. They've maintained independent food production. 63 people, including 17 children. Eleanor felt her stomach tighten. The brigade's pattern was established. Identify self-sufficient communities, surround them, demand integration into their vision of America, and execute the leadership if they refused. We should warn them, Eleanor. That 5 pairs of eyes turned to her with varying degrees of skepticism. "We're 6 people, Eleanor," Zoe said gently, "against what sounds like a coordinated military operation." "We can't save everyone," David added, the weight of his missing children in his voice. Eleanor understood their hesitation. Their group survived by avoiding direct confrontation, by staying mobile, by choosing their battles. But something about this felt different. "The Last Harvest has children," she pressed, "and they've helped others. Remember those antibiotics they traded us when Samir had pneumonia?" Marcus had remained silent, his military training evident in how he processed information before speaking. Now he looked at Eleanor with something approaching respect. "We don't have to engage," he said slowly, "but we could warn them. Give them time to evacuate or prepare." Riley closed her laptop. "I could jam brigade communications temporarily, create confusion about their coordinates. I know a back route," Samir offered, "from when I used to deliver to their marketplace." Eleanor felt the group's resistance softening. This was how they functioned, individual expertise combining to solve problems without a formal power structure. A microcosm of what cooperation could look like in this fractured world. "If we leave now, we can reach them by nightfall," Marcus decided. "Quick warning, no engagement, then we continue north as planned." As they loaded their meager possessions into the truck, Eleanor caught Marcus watching her. "What?" she asked. "You still believe in something, don't you?" His tone wasn't accusatory, but curious. After everything, Eleanor considered this as she secured her backpack. "I believe in what we're doing right now, small acts of decency in an indecent world." "And you think that's enough to turn the tide?" Eleanor had no illusions about their impact on the broader collapse. 6 people couldn't rebuild civilization. But she thought of Hannah, of her students, of the world they should have inherited. "It's not about turning tides," she said finally. "It's about proving that even when systems fail, individual humans can choose something better than madness." Marcus nodded, seeming to accept this, though Eleanor knew his military experience had taught him harsher lessons about human nature under pressure. The truck rumbled to life, David behind the wheel with Samir navigating. Eleanor climbed into the back with Zoe and Riley, while Marcus took the passenger seat, rifle across his lap. As they emerged from the garage into the fading daylight, Eleanor gazed at the city that had once been the seat of global power. Museums, housing humanity's greatest achievements, stood looted and abandoned. Monuments to democracy crumbled from neglect or deliberate destruction. The White House, or what remained of it after the drone strike, was now a fortress for whoever controlled the surrounding blocks this month. Yet as they drove past the ruins, Eleanor noted small signs of resilience. Vegetable gardens sprouting in former traffic medians, solar panels rigged on apartment balconies, children's drawings in chalk on concrete barriers, humanity adapting as it always had. The truck turned north, leaving the city center behind. They passed through neighborhoods transformed by necessity, apartment, buildings with makeshift bridges between balconies, creating elevated communities safe from street violence. Former parks converted to communal farmland, churches and schools repurposed as medical centers or trading posts. Eleanor recorded these observations in her journal, preserving the adaptations of a society in flux. If civilization rebuilt itself someday, these records might provide context for how people navigated the breakdown. "You really think those notes will matter?" Zoe asked, watching Eleanor write. "They matter to me," Eleanor replied. "And maybe to whoever comes after." "Bold of you to assume anyone comes after," Riley muttered, still typing on her laptop, extending the range of her surveillance. "There's always an after," Eleanor said with the certainty of a historian. "Dark ages end, empires fall, and new societies emerge, humans rebuild. Not always for the better," Marcus called from the front. "No," Eleanor agreed. "That's why understanding how we got here matters." David steered them onto what had once been the interstate, now partially reclaimed by nature and blockaded in sections by various territorial markers. They slowed as they approached a checkpoint, a burned-out toll booth, manned by armed civilians, with the green armbands of boundary patrollers, freelance guards who extracted tolls, but generally remained neutral in ideological conflicts. Marcus rolled down the window as a grizzled man approached, shotgun held casually but visibly. "Passing through or stopping?" the guard asked. "Passing," Marcus replied, handing over their standard toll, 2 bottles of purified water and a small bag of antibiotics. The guard examined their offering, then nodded toward the truck. "What's your business northward?" "Trading run," Samir answered smoothly. "Medical supplies for food." The guard seemed satisfied with this explanation. Commerce remained one of the few activities generally permitted across territories. He waved them through but called after them. "Brigades active up there, watch yourselves." Once past the checkpoint, the landscape opened to the suburbs, where the collapse had manifested differently. Here, some neighborhoods had transformed into fortified communes, while others stood abandoned, their resources stripped by successive waves of scavengers. Occasionally they passed the remains of what Eleanor called failure colonies, planned communities that had sought to create islands of normalcy before succumbing to internal conflict, resource depletion, or outside attacks. 2 miles to the "Turn off," Samir directed, consulting a paper map marked with handwritten notes. Eleanor watched the fading daylight cast long shadows across the altered landscape. 3 years into this new reality, nature was already reclaiming human spaces. Vines crawled up traffic signals. Saplings pushed through cracks in the pavement. Animals formerly rarely seen in urban environments, deer, foxes, even the occasional bear, now roamed freely through abandoned neighborhoods. "It's like the planet is healing itself," she murmured. "By removing us," Riley observed darkly. "Not removing," Eleanor corrected. "Reminding us of our place in the system." The truck turned onto a narrower road, then onto what appeared to be a maintenance access path, partially concealed by overgrowth. David navigated carefully, his mechanical expertise evident in how he handled the vehicle over the uneven terrain. "Cut the lights," Marcus instructed as they approached a clearing. "We'll proceed on foot from here." They gathered outside the truck, checking weapons and equipment by the fading natural light. Eleanor carried only a pistol she hoped never to use, but the others prepared with the efficiency of those who'd learned the hard price of unreadiness. "The community is half a mile ahead," Samir said quietly. "They usually have lookouts posted at the perimeter." "Riley and I will approach first," Marcus decided. "The rest of you stay with the truck. If we're not back in 30 minutes, we'll—" "And come looking," Eleanor interrupted firmly. Marcus gave her a level look, then nodded. "Just be smart about it." As Marcus and Riley disappeared into the gathering darkness, Eleanor felt the familiar tightness in her chest, the anxiety of separation, in a world where each goodbye might be final. She'd felt it when her husband Michael left for a supply run in the early days and never returned. She'd felt it when communications with Hannah's quarantine zone went silent. Each loss had carved hollow spaces within her, yet somehow she continued, driven by the historian's compulsion to witness and record. "They'll be all right," Zoe said, misreading Eleanor's expression as worry for their companions. "Marcus knows what he's doing." "I know," Eleanor replied. "I was just thinking about how strange it is, how quickly we've adapted to this way of living." "Humans are resilient," David said, keeping his voice low as he secured the truck. "For better or worse, some more than others," Samir added, his eyes scanning the tree line. "In Mumbai, I lived through riots, floods, infrastructure collapses. Americans had no practice with breakdown before this." Eleanor considered this perspective. Maybe that's why it hit us so hard. We believed our systems were infallible. "No system is infallible," Zoe said, with the certainty of someone who had worked in emergency medicine. "Only adaptable or rigid. The rigid ones shatter." Their philosophical discussion ceased abruptly as a distant crack echoed through the trees, unmistakably. Gunfire! The gunshot shattered the evening stillness like glass breaking. Eleanor's body tensed. Decades of civilian life suddenly overridden by newly acquired survival instincts. David immediately doused their lantern while Zoe and Samir moved into defensive positions behind the truck. "Single shot," Samir whispered, his ear attuned to violence from a past life he rarely discussed. "Not automatic fire. Could be a warning," Zoe suggested, medical kit already in hand, preparing for worst-case scenarios, as she always did. Eleanor closed her eyes, listening intently. No follow-up shots came, but distant shouting echoed through the trees. She couldn't distinguish words, only the urgent cadence of conflict. "We need to move," she decided, surprising herself with her own authority. "They might need help." David shook his head. "Marcus said to wait. Marcus might be the one who needs help," Eleanor countered, checking her pistol. A weapon she'd once protested against owning, now an extension of her survival. Before they could argue further, footsteps crashed through the underbrush. Everyone raised weapons until Riley's voice called out, "It's us! Don't shoot!" She emerged from the darkness, supporting a limping teenage boy with dark skin and a bloodied leg. Marcus followed, walking backward, rifle raised toward the path behind them. "Brigade scouts," Marcus reported tersely. "They found the community's perimeter patrol. This is Eli. He was on lookout duty." The boy couldn't be older than 16, his face contorted with pain and fear. "They shot Thomas?" he gasped. "I think he's dead. They're coming, at least 24 of them with tactical gear." Zoe immediately took control, helping Eli to the truck's rear bumper. "Bullet wound or shrapnel?" she asked, already cutting away. "His pant leg, caught in barbed wire trying to escape," Riley answered for him. "But he's right about the brigade. They're mobilizing for a full assault." Eleanor turned to Marcus, whose expression had hardened into the battlefield calculation she'd seen before. "The community? 60+ people. Minimal defenses," he said. "They're preparing to evacuate, but they need time." The moral equation balanced in Eleanor's mind, 6 survivors against 24 armed extremists. The logical choice was clear: retreat, survive, continue north. Yet something deeper than logic held her in place. Perhaps the professor who had taught generations about moral courage, or perhaps the mother who had lost everyone and couldn't bear to witness another family's destruction. "We can give them time," she said firmly. Marcus studied her face, then glanced at the others. A silent consensus formed among them, not through words, but through the small nods and resolute expressions of people who had already decided their moral boundaries in this broken world. "I can create a diversion," Riley offered, patting her backpack. "I still have those remote noisemakers from the Baltimore escape." "The ravine to the east," Samir suggested. "If we detonate there, sound will echo, make their force seem larger." "I'll get the community moving along the creek bed," Marcus decided. "It's defensible and leads to the old highway interchange." Plans formed with the efficiency of a group that had learned to think collectively. Zoe finished bandaging Eli's leg and administered a precious dose of antibiotics. "You're going back with Marcus," she told the boy. "Guide him to your people. I've given you something for infection, but you'll need proper care." Eli stood shakily, determination replacing fear. "I can still fight. You can still lead," Eleanor corrected gently. "That's what's needed now." They moved with practiced precision, gathering only essential supplies. Riley programmed her devices while David prepared the truck for a rapid departure. Within minutes they had separated into their assigned roles. Marcus and Eli heading back to the community, Riley and Samir moving east to set the diversion. Eleanor, Zoe and David establishing a fallback position where they could monitor the situation and provide emergency extraction if needed. As darkness fully enveloped the forest, Eleanor found herself crouched behind a fallen tree, binoculars focused on the distant lights of brigade vehicles assembling at the community's southern approach. The familiar paralyzing fear crept up her spine, the same fear she'd felt during the university siege when armed men had stormed her classroom, shouting about intellectual corruption. She pushed the memory away, focusing instead on counting vehicles, estimating force strength, noting defensive positions. The historian had become a reluctant tactician in this new world. Her radio crackled softly. "In position," came Riley's whispered confirmation. "Charges set. Awaiting signal." "Marcus reports community evacuation at 30%, David relayed, from his position closer to their truck. "Needs 15 more minutes." Eleanor checked her watch, a wind-up mechanical timepiece that had outlasted the electric grid. "Tell Riley to initiate sequence in 3 minutes. We need to draw them east, away from the evacuation route." The weight of command felt foreign on her shoulders. In her previous life, her authority had extended only to classroom discussions and department meetings. Now, lives depended on her judgment, a responsibility she had never sought but couldn't abdicate. The first explosion came precisely on schedule, a sharp crack followed by the distinct sound of automatic gunfire. Not Riley's devices, but actual weapons. The diversion had already evolved into a skirmish. Through her binoculars, Eleanor watched brigade forces respond, vehicles changing direction, lights sweeping toward the eastern disturbance. The plan was working, but at what cost? Riley and Samir were supposed to plant remote devices, not engage directly. Her radio remained ominously silent. "Zoe," she whispered urgently to the nurse positioned 50 yards to her right. "I've lost contact with Team East." Zoe's response came clipped and professional. "Maintaining position until confirmation of community clearance." Eleanor understood the protocol, but something deeper pulled at her. The bonds formed through shared survival that transcended tactical considerations. These people weren't just allies, they were the closest thing to family she had left. A new sound rose above the gunfire, the low, distinctive rumble of the community's tractors mobilizing for evacuation. Through gaps in the tree line, Eleanor glimpsed shadowy figures moving along the creek bed. Families carrying children, elders supported by younger members, a human chain of mutual protection. Her radio finally crackled to life. "Eleanor," Samir's voice came strained and breathless. "Riley's hit, East Ravine. Brigade approaching our position." The cold clarity of crisis swept through Eleanor. "David, bring the truck around for emergency extraction. Zoe, medical kit, with me." She was already moving, keeping low through the underbrush, pistol in hand. They navigated by sound and instinct through the darkened forest, the intermittent flashes of gunfire providing brief illumination of their path. Eleanor's heart pounded, not with fear now, but with focused urgency, the same feeling that had propelled her through burning university hallways carrying injured students. They found Riley and Samir in a shallow depression, partially concealed by fallen branches. Riley lay pale and still, blood darkening her jacket around her left shoulder. Samir had fashioned a makeshift tourniquet from his belt. "Sniper on the ridge," he reported tersely. "Single shot." She was setting the last device. Zoe immediately took over, cutting away Riley's clothing to expose the wound. Through and through, she assessed. Missed the artery, but she's lost blood. We need to move her now. The crack of a bullet striking a nearby tree terminated their discussion. Eleanor returned fire instinctively, aiming toward the muzzle flash on the ridge. She had no illusion of hitting anything, but suppressive fire. Might buy them seconds. Samir, help Zoe with Riley, she ordered. I'll cover your movement to the extraction point. Eleanor. Samir began to protest. Now. The professor's voice carried the non-negotiable tone that had once silenced classroom disruptions. Now it sent them scrambling into action, Samir lifting Riley's limp form, while Zoe maintained pressure on the wound. Eleanor positioned herself between the sniper and their retreat path, firing measured shots whenever she detected movement. Her academic mind catalogued the surreal transformation of her existence. From analyzing historic conflicts to participating in one, from theoretical ethics to live ammunition decisions. The extraction point lay 100 yards back, a small clearing, where David could maneuver the truck. Eleanor heard its engine before she saw its outline, running without lights to avoid drawing fire. Relief flooded her system, until a blinding spotlight suddenly illuminated the forest, followed by the amplified voice of brigade command. Attention resistance fighters, you are surrounded. Lay down your weapons or be eliminated as enemies of the restored republic. The spotlight swept through the trees, not yet finding them but methodically searching. Eleanor glanced back to see Samir and Zoe freeze mid-stride, Riley unconscious between them. In that moment, Eleanor Reeves, former professor, widow, grieving mother, reluctant survivor, made the decision that would alter their trajectory irrevocably. Get to the truck, she hissed to her companions, then stepped into the open, firing 3 rapid shots toward the spotlight. The beam immediately swung toward her, blinding in its intensity. She raised her empty hand to shield her eyes, using the other to hold her pistol visible but pointed downward, not surrendering but not threatening. I'm unarmed, she called out, the lie buying precious seconds as Samir and Zoe slipped deeper into the shadows with Riley. Professor Eleanor Reeves, Georgetown University. I'm a non-combatant historian documenting the conflict. The spotlight remained fixed on her as dark figures approached. Eleanor heard David's truck engine recede in the distance, confirmation that at least some of her people had escaped. A bitter smile crossed her face. In the old world, her academic credentials might have offered protection. In this one, they marked her as an intellectual enemy of the brigade's twisted vision. The first blow came unexpectedly, a rifle butt to her shoulder, sending her sprawling to the forest floor. As rough hands seized her arms and a hood descended over her head, Eleanor clung to one certainty. For the first time since the collapse, she had chosen sacrifice over survival, and in that choice had reaffirmed something the RABID states had nearly extinguished: her humanity. 3 days in brigade captivity had taught Eleanor Reeves more about human depravity than 30 years of studying history. Blindfolded during transport, she'd been brought to what she gathered was a former government facility, the underground levels of a building with concrete walls and the lingering scent of official bureaucracy. Her cell was small but efficiently designed, with a steel toilet, a thin mattress, and a single light bulb that never turned off. The questions came at irregular intervals, delivered by different interrogators with varying levels of sophistication. They wanted to know about her group, about the Last Harvest community, about rumored resistance networks. Eleanor provided half-truths and fabrications, drawing on historical resistance movements to craft plausible misinformation. Professor Reeves. The door opened, admitting a new figure, a woman in her 40s with the crisp posture of former military and the red armband of brigade leadership. Unlike the previous interrogators, she wore a name badge, Colonel Diane Mercer. I hope you've found your accommodations educational. Eleanor sat up on her mattress, wincing at the pain in her ribs, a souvenir from her second interrogation. The hospitality leaves something to be desired. Mercer's smile never reached her eyes. Humor, the last refuge of the intellectual elite. She pulled a folding chair from the wall and sat opposite Eleanor. My colleagues believe you're just another resistance sympathizer. I think you're something more valuable. A historian documenting the collapse of civil society. Eleanor offered. That's all I am. No, Mercer leaned forward. You're Eleanor Reeves, tenured professor of American political history, author of Fracture Lines, Division and Resilience in American Democracy, and, most interestingly, former consultant to the Department of Homeland Security on domestic ideological threats. Eleanor kept her face neutral, though inwardly she cursed the digital trails that had survived the collapse. Her brief government work had been academic in nature, analyzing historical patterns of extremism for a report that was likely ignored. That was another lifetime, she said carefully. Perhaps, but it makes you uniquely qualified to understand what we're building here. Mercer crossed her legs, comfortable in her authority. The old America was dying long before the collapse, corrupt, divided, weakened by moral relativism and globalist subversion. We're not destroying America, Professor. We're restoring it to its rightful strength. Through fear, isolation, and summary. Executions? Eleanor couldn't keep the historian's analytical tone from her voice. That's not restoration. That's authoritarian regression disguised as patriotic revival. Instead of anger, Mercer responded with something more disturbing, genuine amusement. You sound exactly like my constitutional law professor at Georgetown, before I realized that intellectual objections mean nothing when systems fail. She stood, straightening her uniform. The brigade isn't some temporary militia, Professor. We're the foundation of the new order. And given your expertise, you can either help us build it or be buried beneath it. After Mercer left, Eleanor paced her cell, mind racing. The revelation that her captors understood her background changed the calculation. They wouldn't just execute her as a resistance fighter. They might force her to legitimize their regime with her academic credentials to provide historical justification for their brutality. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by the screams of other prisoners and the constant light. In brief moments of unconsciousness, Eleanor dreamed of Hannah, of her classroom, of the country that had existed before it devoured itself. She was awakened by an unusual sound, not the heavy boots of guards, but a soft, deliberate tap against her cell door. Then silence, then 3 more taps. Eleanor approached cautiously. No voices, no footsteps in the corridor. Something had been pushed beneath her door, a small folded paper. She retrieved it with trembling fingers and unfolded it. In the corner, furthest from the surveillance camera, a simple message in careful handwriting. Friends coming. Be ready tomorrow night. Hope, dangerous, unpredictable hope, fluttered in Eleanor's chest. Had her people tracked her here? It seemed impossible, yet she had witnessed Marcus's tactical resourcefulness, Riley's technological ingenuity, Samir's uncanny ability to navigate hostile territory. She ate the paper, an old historian's trick learned from studying wartime resistance movements. Then she began, preparing mentally for whatever came next, cataloguing the facility's routines based on her observations, guard rotations, at what she estimated were 8-hour intervals, meal deliveries at 0700, 1300, and 1900. Interrogation sessions, seemingly randomized, but typically following meal times. The next day passed with excruciating slowness. Eleanor found herself hyper-aware of every sound, every footstep in the corridor. Her afternoon interrogation, conducted by a young, zealous brigade officer who seemed more interested in ideological conversion than information, tested her ability to maintain composure while mentally planning for multiple contingencies. Evening brought a new development. Instead of the usual tasteless gruel, her dinner tray contained what appeared to be a slightly better meal: processed meat and reconstituted potatoes. More significantly, it came with actual metal utensils rather than the usual plastic. The guard who delivered it was unfamiliar, younger than most, with nervous eyes that never quite met hers. He placed the tray down and whispered, almost imperceptibly, "Under the tray." When the lights flicker, Eleanor gave no indication she'd heard, maintaining the defeated posture she'd cultivated for the cameras. Only after the guard left did she investigate, feeling beneath the tray to discover a small key taped to its underside. Precisely at 21:37, she'd been tracking time by counting seconds. The cell block's lights flickered once, twice, then stabilized. A power fluctuation, or the promised signal? Eleanor made her decision, moving to her cell door and testing the key. It slid in perfectly, turning with a soft click that sounded thunderous in her heightened state. The corridor beyond stood empty, emergency lights casting alternating pools of brightness and shadow. She stepped out, adrenaline sharpening her senses. Left led deeper into the facility. Right led to what she believed was an administrative section, based on the types of personnel she'd observed coming and going. She chose right, moving as quietly as her stiff muscles allowed. At the corridor's end, a door marked "Security" stood ajar, highly irregular in this environment of paranoid control. Eleanor paused, listening for voices or movement within. Hearing nothing, she eased it open. The security office contained monitoring equipment for the cell block, several screens showing empty corridors and occupied cells. Most notably, the guard who should have been manning this station was absent, and a familiar figure sat at the controls. "Riley?" Eleanor gasped. The young hacker looked up, her left arm immobilized in a sling, but her fingers still dancing across the keyboard with her right hand. "Professor! Thank God, we've got about 3 minutes before the systems reset." "How?" Eleanor began, but Riley cut her off. "No time. Marcus and David are creating a diversion at the motor pool. Zoe and Samir are waiting at extraction point. With medical support." She pressed a small radio into Eleanor's hand. "Follow the emergency exit signs to the east stairwell. We've looped the camera feeds, but the guard shift changes in 7 minutes." Eleanor gripped Riley's uninjured shoulder. "You were shot. You shouldn't be here." A ghost of Riley's usual sardonic smile appeared. "Yeah, well, turns out getting shot gives you excellent motivation to hack into brigade security systems." She turned back to the monitors. "Go, now. Channel 3 if you hit trouble." Eleanor wanted to ask a dozen questions, but years of survival had taught her when to move and when to talk. She squeezed Riley's shoulder once more, then slipped back into the corridor, following the faded emergency exit signs. The facility seemed eerily deserted, likely by design, with Riley manipulating security systems and Marcus creating a distraction elsewhere. Eleanor navigated through service corridors and administrative areas, the historian in her noting details even as she fled. Propaganda posters on walls, brigade manifestos in break rooms, the systematic rewriting of American history to justify present brutality. She was 2 corridors from her goal when a door opened ahead, revealing Colonel Mercer herself, flanked by 2 guards. The surprise was mutual, but Mercer recovered first. "Prisoner escape," she shouted, reaching for her sidearm. "Detain her." Eleanor's academic brain suggested surrender. Her survivor's instincts overruled it. She dropped to one knee and pressed. The radio transmitter. "Channel 3, East Corridor compromised." The overhead sprinklers activated instantly, drenching the corridor. In the same moment, the emergency lights shifted to red, and a pre-recorded evacuation message began blaring through the speakers. Riley's contingency plan in action. The guards hesitated in the sudden chaos, just long enough for Eleanor to dart down an adjacent hallway. Behind her, Mercer's voice cut through the alarm. "Don't just stand there, find her!" Eleanor ran past offices and storage rooms, her soaked clothes heavy, but her spirit lighter than it had been in days. The eastern stairwell appeared ahead, and with it, an emergency exit illuminated by a red sign. She hit the exit bar with her shoulder, emerging into the cool night air of what appeared to be a loading dock. Concrete barriers and chain-link fencing surrounded the area, with a single gate standing open on the far side. Beyond it, the distinctive outline of David's truck waited in the shadows. Eleanor had covered half the distance to freedom when spotlights suddenly flooded the yard. A mechanical voice boomed from speakers, "Halt! Security perimeter breached! Lethal force authorized!" From the facility roof, automated defense turrets swiveled toward her, another legacy of pre-collapse militarization, now controlled by brigade technicians. Eleanor froze, caught in the merciless light, calculating impossible odds. The first gunshot made her flinch, but it wasn't aimed at her. Someone was firing at the spotlight controls. The yard plunged back into darkness as the fixtures shattered. "Eleanor, run!" Marcus's voice from somewhere near the perimeter fence. She ran, bullets from the automated system striking concrete around her. Ahead, the truck's engine roared to life. A figure leapt from the shadows, Samir extending his hand to pull her the final distance. "Down!" he shouted, yanking her behind a concrete barrier as bullets pinged overhead. Eleanor pressed herself against the cold surface, breath coming in ragged gasps. "Riley, is she—" "Already extracted through the west exit," Samir assured her. "David has the truck, Zoe's with them. Marcus is providing cover." As if summoned by his name, Marcus appeared beside them, rifle against his shoulder as he fired. Measured shots toward the defense system controls. 30 seconds until that system recalibrates in the dark, he reported. "We move on my mark." Eleanor nodded, gathering her strength for the final sprint. Part of her, the professor who had once believed in systems, institutions, and the fundamental reasonableness of humans, remained stunned by the reality of automated guns firing on American soil at American citizens. But that part grew smaller. With each day of survival, "Mark!" Marcus shouted. They ran together, Samir half carrying Eleanor as her days of captivity caught up with her muscles. The distance to the truck stretched impossibly, bullets kicking up dirt around them. Behind them, shouting voices announced the brigade's full mobilization. David had the truck's rear doors open, Riley and Zoe already inside. Eleanor felt hands pulling her upward as Marcus provided final covering fire before leaping aboard himself. The doors slammed shut as the vehicle lurched forward, tire spinning on gravel before finding purchase. "Go, go, go!" Marcus shouted, and David responded by pushing the aging engine to its limits, crashing through a secondary gate and onto what had once been a highway. Inside the truck's cargo area, illuminated only by a dim emergency light, Eleanor finally saw her rescuers clearly. Riley, pale but conscious, her wounded shoulder professionally bandaged. Zoe, medical kit open as she quickly examined Eleanor for injuries. Samir, keeping watch through a small window in the truck's rear door. Marcus, reloading his weapon with the practiced movements of someone preparing for pursuit. "How?" Eleanor managed, her voice hoarse from disuse. "Riley tracked the brigade's communications after they took you," Zoe explained, shining a penlight into Eleanor's eyes to check for concussion. "We identified their headquarters. Then we found a sympathizer," Samir added. "A young recruit who joined for protection but couldn't stomach their methods." "The last harvest community?" Eleanor asked. "Evacuated successfully," Marcus confirmed. "They're heading for the progressive territory near the old state border. We made contact with their leadership before coming for you." Eleanor leaned back against the truck wall, emotions crashing through her, relief, gratitude, and something unfamiliar, a sense of belonging that she had thought lost forever when her family died. These 5 people, strangers 3 years ago, had risked everything to save her. "Thank you," she whispered, the words wholly inadequate. Riley, despite her injury, managed her characteristic smirk. "Hey, Professor, you took a brigade bullet for..." Me figured we should return the favor. The truck swerved suddenly, throwing them against the side panels. Brigade vehicles in pursuit, David called from the driver's seat. At least 3, coming up fast. Marcus moved to the rear window, assessing. They're herding us east, away from the interstate. That's Patriot Coalition territory, Samir warned. If they push us across that boundary. Eleanor understood the implication. The Patriot Coalition, another ideological faction with its own brutal interpretation of American identity, maintained an uneasy, non-aggression pact with the brigade. If they crossed into coalition territory while being pursued, they'd find themselves caught between 2 hostile forces. Options, she asked, falling naturally back into their collective decision-making process. Marcus gestured to a tattered map, secured to the truck wall. Salvage yard at the old county line. Defensible position, multiple exit routes. 20 minutes at this speed, David called back, but we'll need to lose at least one of these pursuit vehicles first. Eleanor's mind raced through historical parallels, resistance movements, guerrilla tactics, asymmetric warfare. The old toll plaza, she suggested, pointing to the map. Narrow passage, predictable pursuit path. Riley, despite her injury, pulled herself toward her equipment bag. I've still got 2 remote charges. If we can draw them into the plaza and detonate as they pass through. The plan formed quickly, roles assigned based on each person's strengths. David would maintain their lead while decelerating just enough to keep the brigade vehicles in pursuit. Samir and Marcus would deploy at the toll plaza top position Riley's charges. Zoe would prepare medical supplies for the inevitable injuries. Eleanor found herself once again in a coordinator role, her historian's memory of the area's geography proving valuable as they planned approach and exit routes. The familiar rhythm of collaborative survival calmed her racing heart, replacing captivity's helplessness with purposeful action. As they approached the toll plaza, its abandoned booths like sentinels from a forgotten civilization, Eleanor caught Marcus watching, her with an unreadable expression. "What?" she asked, checking her pistol's magazine. "You've changed," he observed. "The professor I met 2 years ago would have argued for evasion, not engagement." Eleanor considered this as the truck slowed for their deployment. That professor believed systems could be reformed from within. This one has seen what happens when systems collapse entirely. She met his eyes directly. But some principles remain worth fighting for. A ghost of a smile touched his normally stoic face. "Welcome to the resistance, Professor." The truck lurched to a temporary stop. Marcus and Samir leapt out, charges in hand, disappearing into the shadows of the toll structure. 30 seconds later, they returned, and David accelerated again, pushing the vehicle through the plaza and onto the open road beyond. In the side mirror, Eleanor watched the brigade vehicles enter the choke point, their headlights cutting through the darkness. Riley held the detonator, waiting for the precise moment when all pursuers were within the blast radius. "Now," Eleanor said quietly. Riley pressed the trigger. The night behind them erupted in flame and thunder, the toll plaza collapsing inward upon the brigade vehicles. No lives lost, but pursuit effectively ended, a small victory in a war they hadn't chosen but couldn't avoid. As they continued toward the salvage yard rendezvous, Eleanor gazed out at the transformed American landscape passing in the darkness. The historian in her catalogued the visible evidence of collapse, abandoned vehicles, darkened towns, territorial markers. The survivor in her assessed threats and opportunities. But something new had awakened as well, the resistance fighter, who now understood that documenting history and shaping it were not mutually exclusive. "Where to after the salvage yard?" David called from the front. Eleanor looked at her companions, battered, exhausted, but unbroken. "North," she decided. "There are rumors of communities along the old Canadian border that have maintained pre-collapse values, actual democracy, rule of law. That's at least 2 weeks' travel through contested territories," Zoe pointed out. "And every factional border crossing brings new dangers," Samir added. Eleanor nodded, acknowledging the challenges. But we've seen what happens when we accept the alternatives. The last harvest community proves people still want something better than rage and fear. She touched the journal in her pocket, the record of America's unraveling that might someday help rebuild it. Maybe it's time we stopped just surviving and started reconnecting the fragments. In the dim light of the truck's interior, something shifted in her companion's expressions, a spark of purpose beyond mere survival. Even Riley, cynical by both nature and experience, seemed to consider the possibility. Marcus summed it up with military precision, a mission rather than an escape plan. Yes, Eleanor confirmed, the academic and the survivor finally finding common purpose. Because if the RABID states represent what America has become, someone needs to remember and demonstrate what it was meant to be. 2 weeks on the road had transformed Eleanor's theoretical mission into a grueling test of endurance. Their journey northward followed a patchwork map of relatively safe corridors between territorial boundaries, places where factional control blurred enough to allow passage. Each border crossing required careful planning, sometimes bribes, occasionally subterfuge. They now sat concealed in an abandoned fiber optic station 50 miles from what had once been the Pennsylvania-New York border. Rain drummed steadily on the metal roof, providing both cover for their whispered strategy session and a vital source of fresh water collected in rigged tarps outside. The coalition checkpoint at Elmira is our biggest obstacle, Marcus explained, tracing their route on a weathered map spread across equipment cases. Heavy surveillance, shoot-on-sight policy for known resistance members, which we all are now, Riley added, her injured shoulder healing but still limiting her mobility. She'd spent the downtime enhancing their communications equipment, scavenging parts from abandoned technology. Brigade would have distributed our descriptions after the escape. Eleanor studied the alternative routes. What about the western approach, through the old conservation areas? Samir shook his head. Too exposed. Drone patrols. The tunnels, David suggested quietly. All eyes turned to him. The mechanic rarely offered tactical suggestions, but when he did, they listened. The old maintenance tunnels for the interstate. They run parallel to the main roadway but were abandoned even before the collapse. Zoe frowned. Tight quarters, limited exits. If we're caught there, we won't be, David insisted. I worked highway maintenance one summer during college. Those tunnels are off most official maps, and they connect to drainage systems that could get us past the checkpoint entirely. The group fell silent, weighing the options. This was how they functioned now. Collective decision-making based on specialized knowledge, with lives balancing on each choice. It's worth investigating, Marcus finally decided. David and I will do recon tomorrow. The rest of you prepare supplies for possible underground travel. As the others dispersed to their assigned tasks, Eleanor remained at the map, tracing their journey with a historian's perspective. They'd traveled through the ruins of 7 former states, each transformed into something unrecognizable. Former Maryland was now divided between brigade territory and anarchic free zones, where survival depended on constantly shifting alliances. Pennsylvania had fractured along its urban-rural divide, with isolated communities establishing micro-governments based on pre-collapse county lines. Thinking about your book? Marcus asked, returning to collect his gear. Eleanor smiled faintly, wondering what I'd title the chapter about our current situation. Tunneling to freedom? Underground democracy? He offered rare levity, maybe American fragments, she mused. We keep encountering pieces of what used to be a whole, communities trying to rebuild using shards of the old system. Marcus considered this as he checked his weapon. You still believe there's something worth salvaging? It wasn't a question, but Eleanor answered anyway. I believe there were principles worth preserving, even if the structures failed. She gestured toward their group, scattered around the station at various tasks. Look at us, different backgrounds, different politics, before the collapse. Now we make decisions collectively, protect each other, maintain some basic ethics in a world that's abandoned them. That's not nothing. It's 6 people, Eleanor. Every resistance movement starts small. Marcus didn't argue further, but Eleanor noticed something shift in his expression, a softening of the tactical pragmatism that usually dominated his thinking. Before she could pursue the conversation, Riley called them both to the communications station she'd established in the corner. "I'm picking up encrypted transmission bursts," she explained, headphones around her neck as she manipulated a salvaged field radio. "Brigade standard channels, but the encryption pattern is different." "Can you break it?" Marcus asked. Riley snorted. "Already did. It's actually an older cipher. Pre-collapse military grade. The interesting part is what they're saying." She handed the headphones to Eleanor. "Listen." Through the static, Eleanor made out fragments. "Operation Restoration, Phase 2 implementation, Southern contingents mobilizing, civilian consolidation protocols." She removed the headphones, her academic training automatically analyzing the terminology. "Military operation communications, but with a formal structure we haven't seen from Brigade before. They've typically used decentralized command systems." "They're consolidating," Marcus translated, his military background providing context. "Moving from insurgent tactics to conventional force posture." "But why now?" Samir asked, joining them. "And what's civilian consolidation?" Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the rain outside. "Historical precedent suggests it's euphemistic authoritarian regimes consolidate civilian populations to control resources, labor, and eliminate resistance hiding among general populations." "Forced relocation," Zoe clarified from across the room, where she was conducting a medical inventory. "Like the strategic Hamlet program in Vietnam or Soviet collectivization." "We need more information," Marcus decided. "This changes our calculus if Brigade is expanding its territorial control northward while we're trying to move through the region." Riley tapped commands into her jury-rigged system. "I can broaden the scan, try to pick up more transmissions from different Brigade units. Might give us a clearer picture of the operational footprint." "Do it," Marcus agreed, then turned to Eleanor. "You and I should revise our route planning based on possible Brigade movement corridors. For hours, they worked to build a comprehensive picture of the evolving threat." Riley intercepted and decoded additional transmissions that painted an alarming picture. Brigade forces were indeed consolidating under centralized command, with significant material moving northward. References to integration protocols and resistance elimination appeared with increasing frequency. "They're preparing for something big," Marcus concluded as they gathered around the map again that evening. "A coordinated push to connect their territorial holdings and bring independent communities under their control." "Using what leverage?" Eleanor asked, the historian seeking the underlying dynamics. Samir, who had been analyzing the pattern of reported Brigade movements, pointed to markings he'd made on the map. "Food production areas, water treatment facilities, medical supply caches. They're seizing critical infrastructure first, then establishing control zones around them." "Siege tactics," Eleanor murmured. "Control the necessities and communities, either integrate or starve. What does this mean for our plan to reach the northern communities?" David asked, the practical question hanging heavily in the rain-dampened air. Marcus studied the map with military precision. "It means our window is closing. We either move faster, ahead of their advance, or we risk being caught in territory under active military operation." "The tunnels are our best option," David reiterated. "If Brigade is moving conventional forces, they'll be focused on roads, bridges, major infrastructure. Underground passages won't be on their priority list." Eleanor noted the strategic shift in their mission. What had begun as a journey toward rumored democratic communities was evolving into a race against authoritarianism's advance. The historian in her recognized the pattern from countless collapsed states throughout history, the vulnerable period when competing visions for rebuilding battled for dominance. "We should warn these communities," she said suddenly, the moral imperative clear to her. "If we have this intelligence about brigade movements, they deserve to know, and risk our own passage." Riley challenged, though without her usual cynicism. "Broadcasting warnings could expose our position." "We don't need to broadcast," Eleanor countered. "We can carry the information physically, warn each community as we pass through." The group exchanged glances, a silent evaluation of risk versus responsibility. Zoe spoke first, supporting Eleanor. "We have medical skills, technical knowledge, information about brigade tactical approaches. That's valuable to communities preparing defenses." "It would slow us down," Marcus pointed out, though Eleanor noted he didn't reject the idea outright. "It might also secure a safer passage," Samir suggested pragmatically. "Communities are more likely to help travelers who bring valuable intelligence and skills." Outside, the rain intensified, a metallic drumming that underscored the gravity of their decision. This wasn't merely about their own survival anymore. It was about what kind of world would emerge from America's ashes. Would the RABID states consolidate into permanent authoritarian territories, or could the fragments reassemble into something that preserved the better aspects of what had been lost? "We vote," Eleanor proposed, falling back on their established method for major decisions. Majority carries. One by one they voiced their positions. David, Zoe, and Samir sided with Eleanor. They would warn communities and offer assistance while continuing their journey north. Riley reluctantly joined them, leaving Marcus the sole tactical objector. "Noted and overruled," he conceded with the ghost of a smile. "But we maintain operational security. No broadcasting, no drawing unnecessary attention. We warn only established communities with proven independence from brigade influence." Eleanor felt something she hadn't experienced since before the collapse. A sense of purpose beyond survival, a connection to principles larger than herself. "Agreed, we move at first light, beginning with the tunnel reconnaissance." Dawn brought clearing skies and the quiet efficiency of people accustomed to rapid relocations. David and Marcus departed for tunnel reconnaissance while the others prepared equipment and supplies for possible underground travel. Eleanor helped Zoe inventory their medical supplies, a critical resource for both their journey and as potential goodwill offerings to communities they encountered. "You've changed our mission," Zoe observed as they packed field dressings into waterproof containers. "From escape to resistance," Eleanor considered this. "I think the mission was always there beneath the surface. We just needed the right catalyst to recognize it." "The brigade transmission intercepts." Partly, Eleanor sealed a container of antibiotics. "But more the realization that if we only run, we're accepting their vision of the future. Every community that falls to brigade control is another piece of our shared history rewritten by force." Zoe nodded, understanding the historian's perspective. "You think these northern communities actually exist? The ones maintaining democratic principles?" "I think enough people remember what we lost to try rebuilding it," Eleanor replied. "Whether they've succeeded, that's what we need to discover." Their conversation ended as Riley called them urgently to the communication station. "Brigade channels are lighting up," she reported, adjusting frequencies. "Multiple units converging southeast of our position." "Marcus and David?" Samir asked, immediately alert. "No communication from them yet," Riley replied, tension evident in her voice despite her attempt at clinical detachment. Eleanor moved to the map, tracing possible locations. "The tunnel entrance is here," she indicated, "approximately 3 miles. From our position, if brigade forces are approaching from the southeast, they'd be right in their path." Zoe finished grimly. Samir was already gathering weapons. "We need to warn them." "Wait." Riley held up her hand, listening intently to her headphones. "I've got something. Local brigade tactical channel. They're not hunting our people. She turned to the others, eyes wide. They found a community, calling it a liberation operation for New Canton settlement. Civilian collection protocols initiated. Eleanor felt her blood run cold. New Canton, that's the farming cooperative we traded with last month. At least 40 families trying to maintain independence. The moral calculation took only seconds. Samir, Zoe, gather medical supplies and the spare ammunition. Riley, can you establish communication with Marcus and David? Riley nodded, already adjusting her equipment. Short-range encrypted burst. If they're monitoring, they'll receive. Tell them to complete the tunnel reconnaissance as planned and return here, Eleanor instructed. The three of us will investigate the brigade operation at New Canton. Investigate, not engage, Samir clarified, though his expression suggested he anticipated Eleanor's answer. We gather intelligence, assess the situation, and help civilians if possible without exposing ourselves, she confirmed. The professor had indeed become something else, not quite a resistance fighter, but certainly no longer a neutral observer. If the brigade is implementing their civilian consolidation protocols, people will be at risk. Within 20 minutes, they had moved out, traveling light through the overgrown back roads that had once connected small communities. Eleanor felt the weight of leadership, a role she hadn't sought but couldn't abdicate. These decisions affecting lives weren't theoretical scenarios in her classroom anymore. They were immediate moral choices with concrete consequences. They approached New Canton from the western ridgeline, using the tree cover for concealment. From this vantage point, the unfolding situation became horrifyingly clear. Brigade forces had established a perimeter around the settlement, a collection of repurposed farm buildings and greenhouses where the community had created a sustainable agricultural system. Armed personnel were systematically moving through the buildings, forcing residents into the central commons area. Through binoculars, Eleanor could see the separation process underway. Men divided from women, children gathered separately, all under armed supervision. Some residents were being individually questioned, then directed to different holding areas. Classification protocols, Samir whispered, his voice tight with controlled anger. Identifying skilled laborers, potential security threats, leadership figures, and medical processing, Zoe added, pointing to a station where brigade personnel in distinctive white armbands examined residents. Likely identifying the ill, elderly, or disabled, Eleanor felt nauseous recognition, the historian seeing patterns from humanity's darkest chapters replaying before her eyes. Authoritarian consolidation always followed the same brutal logic. Extract value from the conquered population, eliminate potential resistance, and dispose of those deemed burdens. We need to do something, she whispered. Decades of academic detachment crumbling in the face of immediate human suffering. 3 people against a brigade tactical unit, Samir reminded her, though his expression showed he shared her impulse. Eleanor scanned the scene methodically, applying her analytical training to identify possibilities. They're processing groups. Sequentially, she observed, the western holding area appears to be for those already processed. The fence line there backs against the orchard. Zoe followed her thinking immediately. If some could reach that fence line during a distraction, we create chaos, Samir suggested, not by attacking brigade forces directly, but by generating confusion. A fire in one of the outlying buildings, perhaps. The plan formed quickly, precise, limited in scope, designed to create an opportunity for escape without directly engaging superior forces. Eleanor would position herself near the western perimeter to guide escapees, while Samir created a distraction at the fuel storage tanks on the settlement's eastern edge. Zoe would establish a medical collection point in the orchard for any injured. Evacuees, they separated with minimal communication, each understanding their role. Eleanor circled through the woods Toriach the western fence line, her historian's mind still cataloguing the methodical brutality of the scene before her, while her newly awakened activist spirit prepared to intervene. She had just reached position when a deafening explosion rocked the eastern portion of the settlement. Samir had succeeded, perhaps too well, as flames leapt higher than anticipated, engulfing the storage area. Brigade forces responded predictably, mobile units racing toward the fire, while perimeter guards maintained their positions but turned their attention toward the commotion. Eleanor used the confusion to approach the fence, making visual contact with several residents in the western holding area. She recognized one, an older man named Thomas, who had traded heirloom vegetable seeds with their group last month. "Thomas," she called softly. When he turned, recognition and hope flashed across his face. "Western fence, through Theachard. Medical. Help waiting." Spread the word quietly, the message transmitted through subtle gestures among the processed detainees. As brigade forces focused on containing the spreading fire, small groups began moving casually toward the western edge of the holding area, exploiting gaps in the perimeter security. Eleanor used wire cutters to create an opening in the fence, concealed behind a row of raspberry bushes that had once defined the farm's boundary. One by one, residents slipped through. First children passed by adults who stayed behind, then elderly who couldn't be useful to brigade labor requirements, then others who seized the chance for freedom. "How many more coming?" Eleanor asked Thomas, as he helped an elderly woman through the fence. "Maybe 20, he whispered. "The others are either being held separately or chose to stay with their property." Eleanor nodded grimly, understanding the impossible choices people faced. Some would calculate that survival meant adaptation to brigade control, particularly those with immovable assets or family members too fragile to flee. She was helping a young mother and infant through the fence when shouts erupted from the main. Processing area. Their extraction had been discovered. Brigade troops began racing toward the western perimeter, weapons raised. "Go," she urged the remaining escapees, drawing her own weapon. "Through the orchard! Medical team waiting!" As the last civilians disappeared into the cover of fruit trees, Eleanor prepared to follow, knowing she had only seconds before brigade forces reached her position. A bullet splintered the fence post beside her head, followed by a commanding shout. "Halt! Resistance operative!" She dropped and rolled away from the voice, returning fire not with any hope of hitting targets, but to buy precious seconds for retreat. The orchard lay just 20 yards away. If she could reach it, the dense plantings would provide cover for her escape to the rendezvous point. Eleanor ran in a zigzag pattern, decades of reading about tactical movements suddenly translated into desperate muscle memory. Bullets cut through leaves around her as she reached the first row of trees, then the second. The firing intensified, but the orchard's configuration forced her pursuers to shoot blindly through vegetation. She was halfway to the rendezvous when a searing pain exploded in her right thigh. The impact threw her forward, face striking loamy soil between apple tree rows. Training overrode pain. Keep moving. Stay conscious. Apply pressure. Eleanor dragged herself forward, leaving a blood trail that would lead brigade forces directly to her. "Eleanor!" Zoe's voice, somewhere ahead. "Stay back!" Eleanor called hoarsely. "They're right behind me!" But the choice was made for her as strong hands suddenly gripped her shoulders, pulling her into the shelter of a drainage culvert beneath the orchard access road. Samir's face appeared above her, streaked with soot from the explosion. Zoe materialized beside him, already cutting away Eleanor's pant leg to access the wound. "Through and through," she assessed. "Clinically. Missed the artery, but you're losing blood." "Brigade?" Eleanor managed through gritted teeth. "Still searching the orchard," Samir reported, peering cautiously from their hiding place. "But they'll find your blood trail soon." Zoe worked with practiced efficiency, applying pressure bandages while administering a precious dose of morphine from their limited supply. "Can you move if we support you?" Eleanor nodded, though the prospect seemed distant through the haze of shock and emerging pain. The evacuees. Moving with the second group now, Samir assured her. Thomas is leading them to the regional exchange point. We've bought them a chance. A chance. In this fractured world, perhaps that was all anyone could offer, not certainty, not salvation, just the possibility of choosing one's own path a little longer. As Samir and Zoe helped her to her feet, supporting her weight between them, Eleanor found an odd clarity through the pain. They were no longer simply surviving the rabid states. They were actively working to define what would rise from the ashes. The journey back to their temporary base became a blur of pain management and careful concealment as brigade search parties combed the surrounding area. By nightfall, they had reunited with Marcus and David, whose tunnel reconnaissance had yielded promising results, alongside grave concerns. The tunnels will work, David confirmed as Zoe rebandaged Eleanor's leg in the shelter of the fiber optic station. But brigade movements suggest they're expanding the checkpoint system. Within days, they'll likely control all major surface routes in this region. We helped 23 people escape today, Eleanor counted, the small victory sustaining her through waves of pain. People who'll carry warnings to other communities about brigade consolidation tactics. Marcus studied her with an unreadable expression, and nearly lost you in the process. Worth it, she replied simply. Something shifted in the former Marine's posture, a subtle but definitive change. Yes, he agreed, surprising everyone. It was. He spread the tunnel schematics across their planning table, and now we need to adapt our approach. We're not just passing through anymore. We're actively countering brigade operations. Riley glanced up from her communications equipment. You're on board with the resistance mission now? Let's say I've recognized the strategic value of information warfare, Marcus replied diplomatically. If we can help communities prepare for brigade consolidation while establishing an intelligence network, we create obstacles to authoritarian control without direct military confrontation. Eleanor smiled through her pain. The tactical pragmatist and the historical idealist had found common ground, not in abstract principles, but in concrete actions that preserved human dignity against systematic oppression. The northern communities, she said, bringing them back to their original mission. They become even more important now, not just as a destination, but as potential allies in a broader resistance network. As night deepened around their temporary shelter, the 6 survivors leaned over maps and plans, no longer merely plotting an escape route, but mapping the first fragile connections of what might become a true alternative to the rabid ideology consuming the former United States. Their individual expertise, military strategy, historical analysis, medical knowledge, technical skills, resource management, communications, combined into something more significant than survival. Through her pain, Eleanor felt something unfamiliar, bloom in her chest, not just hope, which was dangerous and unreliable, but purpose, the certainty that even in a fractured world, the actions of a few committed individuals could preserve something worth rebuilding. 3 days of careful travel through maintenance tunnels had brought them to the outskirts of what had once been Binghamton, New York. Eleanor's leg wound had begun healing thanks to Zoe's medical expertise, though she still relied on a makeshift crutch fashioned by David from salvaged materials. The tunnels had proven effective for avoiding brigade patrols, but had taken their toll in other ways. The constant darkness, stale air, and confined spaces wearing on both body and spirit. They emerged at dusk through a maintenance hatch concealed within an abandoned railroad depot. Above ground, the early autumn air felt impossibly fresh after days underground. Eleanor breathed deeply as Marcus and Samir scouted the immediate area, confirming they had successfully bypassed the brigade's expanded checkpoint system. Clear for now, Marcus reported, returning to help unload their equipment. But there's activity in the city center, lights, vehicles, someone's operating there. Riley, who had been configuring her communications equipment to scan local transmissions, looked up sharply. "I'm picking up unencrypted radio traffic, civilian channels, not brigade protocols." Hope surged through the group. Civilian communications suggested an independent community, potentially one of the democratic holdouts they sought. After days in darkness, the prospect of finding allies energized them despite their exhaustion. "We should make contact," Eleanor suggested, leaning on her crutch. "If they're broadcasting openly, they might be organized enough to have established governance." "Or it's a trap," Marcus countered, though without his former reflexive cynicism. "Brigade has used false civilian broadcasts before." They debated briefly. Before settling on a compromise, David and Samir would conduct close reconnaissance of the broadcast source, while the others established a secure position in the depot's former administrative offices. If the community proved legitimate, they would attempt diplomatic contact. As David and Samir departed, Eleanor worked with Zoe to create a defensible medical station, while Riley expanded her communications monitoring and Marcus secured the perimeter. The rhythm of their cooperation had become instinctive, each applying specialized skills to their collective security without requiring direction. "You should rest that leg," Zoe advised, noting Eleanor's pallor after the day's exertion. "Soon," Eleanor promised, continuing to unpack medical supplies. "What do you make of those broadcasts? Legitimate community or brigade deception?" Zoe considered this as she organized their dwindling antibiotic supply. "The pattern feels authentic. Brigade psychological operations tend toward formal structure and specific messaging. These transmissions have the inconsistency of actual civilian communications." Before Eleanor could respond, Riley called from her station. "Getting something new, a broadcast on emergency frequencies. Listen." She amplified the signal, allowing a woman's voice to fill their temporary shelter. "Republic of the Northern Territories welcomes all peaceful travelers seeking refuge from factional conflict. Our communities maintain pre-collapse constitutional principles and democratic governance. Approach checkpoints with hands visible. All weapons must be declared." The transmission continued, describing entry protocols, resource contribution expectations, and fundamental rights guaranteed within their territory. Eleanor felt her historian's skepticism battling with desperate hope. The message contained elements that resonated with authentic democratic principles, yet seemed too perfect, as if designed specifically to appeal to those seeking an alternative to factional brutality. "It could be legitimate," she said cautiously. "The reference to constitutional principles and specific rights protections suggests organized governance beyond mere survival." "Or someone who knows exactly what desperate people want to hear," Marcus countered, though he too seemed tempted by the possibility. They were still analyzing the broadcast when David's voice came through their short-range communicator. Tense, but controlled. "Returning with company, friendly, repeat, friendly contact established." 20 minutes later, David and Samir appeared at the depot entrance, accompanied by 3 individuals whose appearance immediately distinguished them from typical wasteland survivors. 2 men and a woman, all wearing matching navy blue utility uniforms with an unfamiliar insignia, a circular emblem showing the Great Lakes region superimposed with a scales of justice symbol. More strikingly, their equipment appeared well maintained, their bearing professional rather than desperate. "Representatives from the Republic of the Northern Territories," David explained as they entered. "This is Captain Eliza Harmon and Officers Chen and Rodriguez." Captain Harmon stepped forward, a woman in her early 40s, with close-cropped grey hair and the confident posture of formal military training. "We've been monitoring movement through this region for several weeks," she explained. "Your tunnel emergence triggered our proximity sensors." Eleanor exchanged glances with Marcus, both noting the technological sophistication this implied. "You maintain surveillance systems?" Limited but effective, Harmon confirmed. Part of our border security protocols. We've been particularly vigilant since brigade forces began their northern consolidation campaign. The revelation that this group possessed detailed intelligence about brigade movements raised both hope and caution among Eleanor's group. Riley spoke next, her natural skepticism evident. You're claiming to represent an actual functioning government, with borders, laws, the works. Not claiming, Ms. Cooper. Demonstrating, Harmon replied, the use of Riley's surname causing a ripple of tension. Yes, we know who you are. All of you. Professor Eleanor Reeves, former DHS consultant. Marcus Hale, Marine Force Recon. Riley Cooper, cybersecurity prodigy. Zoe Chen, emergency medicine specialist. David Alvarez, structural engineer. Samir Nadim, supply logistics expert. The comprehensive knowledge of their backgrounds stunned the group into momentary silence. Eleanor recovered first, historian's analysis overriding alarm. You have access to pre-collapse databases. That suggests significant infrastructure preservation. Indeed, Harmon smiled slightly. The Northern Territories maintained critical systems during the collapse by implementing emergency protocols developed after the 2030 grid failures. While the South tore itself apart with ideological violence, our region pooled resources, protected key infrastructure, and established constitutional crisis governance. How large is your territory? Marcus asked, tactical assessment evident in his tone. Portions of former New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, and collaboration agreements with Canadian provincial authorities, Officer Rodriguez answered. Approximately 12 million citizens under unified constitutional governance. The scale described was almost incomprehensible after years of fractured micro-territories and constantly shifting boundaries. Eleanor felt simultaneous hope and disbelief, the possibility that civilization had not merely survived, but evolved in pockets beyond the chaos they'd experienced. Why haven't we heard of you before now? She challenged, academic skepticism asserting. Itself, a functioning democratic society of that size would generate refugees, trade networks, intelligence circulation. Careful isolation was necessary during the critical stabilization period, Harmon explained. We maintained buffer zones between our territory and the collapsing regions, allowing distorted information about northern communities to circulate without confirmation. Only recently have we begun limited outreach as part of our containment strategy against brigade expansion. The explanation contained internal logic, yet something in Harmon's terminology triggered Eleanor's analytical caution. Containment strategy? Against ideological contagion, Harmon clarified. The RABID states represent not just territorial threats but memeticones, belief systems that spread like viruses through vulnerable populations. We've studied how brigade ideology replicates itself through exploitation of fear, scarcity, and identity insecurity. The clinical analysis struck Eleanor as simultaneously impressive and disturbing, reminiscent of her own academic work, but with a cold pragmatism that suggested these northern territories might not represent the democratic ideal they'd been seeking. What exactly are you offering us? Marcus asked directly, cutting through theoretical discussions to practical reality. Sanctuary, Harmon replied simply. Citizenship within a functioning society. Medical care for your injuries. Positions utilizing your expertise in our ongoing stability operations. And in return, Riley pressed, always alert to hidden costs. Your knowledge of brigade operations, movement patterns, and territorial control methods, Harmon answered without hesitation. Your group has demonstrated remarkable mobility through contested regions. That intelligence is valuable to our security planning. The offer seemed reasonable, a fair exchange of information for sanctuary. Yet Eleanor noted the careful emphasis on stability rather than freedom, on security rather than rights. Small linguistic signals that raised questions about the true nature of this supposed democratic haven. "We'd like to see your territory for ourselves before making any commitments," she said carefully. Harmon nodded, unsurprised. "Of course, we maintain a forward operating base 20 miles north of here. Transport can be arranged by morning. You'll be given a preliminary orientation before proceeding to the main civilian territories." As the discussion continued, addressing practical matters of transport and immediate security, Eleanor observed the Northern Territory representatives with historians' attention to detail. Their equipment, communications devices, weapons, even the quality of their uniforms suggested access to manufacturing capacity beyond anything she'd seen since the collapse. If legitimate, this represented hope beyond their wildest expectations. Yet something nagged at her analytical mind. The two perfect answers, the comprehensive knowledge of their backgrounds, the clinical terminology when discussing ideological containment. As a historian, she recognized the patterns of information control that often accompanied even benevolent authoritarianism. The Northern Territory representatives departed at nightfall, promising to return with transport by morning. Eleanor's group gathered for a private assessment. Once certain, they were alone. "Thoughts?" she asked simply. "Their equipment is authentic," David offered first. "Not scavenged or repurposed. Actual manufacturing with consistent quality control. I haven't seen that since before the collapse." "Their intelligence-gathering capabilities are concerning," Marcus added. "They knew details about us that aren't in any public databases. That suggests either extensive surveillance networks or human intelligence sources throughout contested territories." "Could be legitimate," Samir suggested cautiously. "Regional governance emerging from the chaos, just as historical patterns would predict. Former states with shared resources banding together under emergency constitutional frameworks." Eleanor nodded, acknowledging all perspectives. "Riley, you've been unusually quiet." The young tech specialist looked up from her terminal, expression troubled. "I've been analyzing their communication patterns against known pre-collapse protocol. Databases, there's something familiar about their terminology and signaling structure." "Familiar how?" Zoe pressed. "It contains encrypted markers consistent with project continuity," Riley said finally. "A black-budget contingency program developed by certain federal agencies after the 2030 infrastructure attacks, designed to maintain governmental authority even if conventional systems collapsed." A chill settled over the group as implications became clear. Eleanor voiced what they all suspected. "You're saying these Northern Territories might not be a grassroots democratic emergence at all, but a pre-planned governmental contingency activated during the collapse. A shadow government," Marcus translated bluntly, "with unknown constitutional legitimacy or oversight mechanisms." "But still actual governance," David pointed out. "After years of chaos, does the origin matter if they're maintaining order, infrastructure, medical care?" The profound question hung in the air. The core dilemma of post-collapse ethics: was imperfect stability preferable to principled chaos? Would they trade certain freedoms for security, transparency for functioning systems? Eleanor thought of her historical studies. How often societies emerging from collapse embraced authoritarian stability before evolving toward greater freedoms. Perhaps this represented a necessary transitional phase. "We should proceed cautiously," she decided finally. "Accept transport to their forward base, gather more information before making judgments or commitments." As the others nodded agreement, Riley spoke again, her tone uncharacteristically hesitant. "There's something else. When I ran background recognition protocols on their communications, I found a partial match to an encrypted signal I detected near DC 3 months ago. When Eleanor was captured by the brigade," Zoe realized immediately. "Yes," Riley confirmed, "the transmission patterns share structural similarities with communications from Colonel Mercer's command channel." The implication landed like a physical blow. Eleanor voiced the terrible possibility. "You think the Northern Territories and the brigade are connected?" "Not directly allied," Riley clarified. but possibly emerging from the same contingency protocols, following parallel tracks with different ideological overlays. Two faces of the same emergency governance system. The twist created a seismic shift in their understanding. What if the chaotic collapse they'd experienced hadn't been entirely organic, but partially engineered? What if the ideological extremes of the RABID states represented not just societal breakdown, but controlled opposition within a larger containment strategy? We've been asking the wrong question, Eleanor realized. Historians' pattern recognition assembling a disturbing new framework. We've been seeking who might rebuild America, when perhaps America never fully collapsed. It just transformed into something unrecognizable, with different factions serving different purposes within a larger containment system. As night deepened, around them, the 6 survivors contemplated this paradigm shift, not just in their immediate plans, but in their understanding of the world they'd been navigating. The Northern Territories might offer survival, but at what cost to truth? The historian, the soldier, the hacker, the healer, the builder, and the provider faced their most complex moral calculation. Yet, we proceed as planned, Marcus finally decided, his tactical mind adapting to new intelligence. But we maintain our protocols. Trust is verified, not assumed. Eleanor nodded, feeling the weight of history pressing down, not just the history she had studied, but the history they were now creating through their choices. Tomorrow, we discover whether we've found salvation or merely a more sophisticated cage. Dawn arrived with the promised Northern Territory transport, a converted military vehicle running on what appeared to be synthetic fuel, another indicator of advanced resource capabilities. Captain Harmon greeted them with professional courtesy, overseeing the loading of their limited equipment while explaining security protocols for their journey. The route passes through a buffer zone, she informed them. Minimal brigade presence, but we maintain defensive positions against potential incursion. You'll observe military operations that may contextualize our discussion yesterday. Eleanor exchanged subtle glances with her companions as they boarded the vehicle. Each carried concealed emergency provisions and communications equipment, a precaution Marcus had insisted upon despite the apparent legitimacy of their hosts. Trust remained a luxury none of them took for granted. The transport's interior surprised them. Clean, well-maintained, with functioning technology that hadn't been cobbled together from salvage. Actual manufactured components, consistent design, evidence of industrial production beyond scavenging. Eleanor noted these details with both hope and heightened wariness. Your leg should be examined by our medical team when we arrive, Officer Chen told Eleanor, noticing her wince as the vehicle navigated rough terrain. We maintain surgical facilities with pre-collapse standards. Impressive resource allocation, Eleanor commented neutrally. Most communities we've encountered prioritize basic antibiotics and wound care over advanced facilities. Scale changes, capabilities, Harmon responded from the front compartment. Individual communities cannot sustain specialized medical infrastructure. Unified governance allows for centralized resource management across former state boundaries. The answer was reasonable, yet contained the same clinical tone that continued to trigger Eleanor's academic skepticism. Throughout her career studying political systems, she had developed an ear for the linguistic patterns of institutional power. The subtle difference between governance focused on citizens versus systems. As they traveled north, the landscape gradually transformed from the familiar post-collapse devastation to something more ordered. They passed through checkpoints manned by uniformed personnel, observed reconstruction efforts on critical infrastructure, and eventually entered territories showing signs of actual recovery. Maintained roads, functional power distribution, even agricultural operations with mechanical equipment. Your containment of the collapse was remarkably effective, Marcus observed professionally. These territories show minimal disruption patterns compared to regions we've traversed. Preparation. And isolation, Harmon explained. When it became clear that societal breakdown was accelerating beyond control points, regional authorities implemented emergency separation protocols. Critical infrastructure was defensively hardened, essential personnel secured, and borders established to prevent contamination. The clinical terminology, contamination, control points, separation protocols, continued reinforcing Eleanor's concerns about the true nature of this governance system. Yet the visible evidence of stability, of actual civilization functioning beyond mere survival, created a powerful counterweight to her skepticism. Midday brought them to what Harmon called an integration center, a facility processing refugees and travelers seeking entry to the Northern Territories. The scale was substantial: dozens of intake stations, medical screening areas, skills assessment centers, and temporary housing units, all operating with organized efficiency. All entrants undergo comprehensive evaluation, Harmon explained, as they observed the facility from an administrative overview platform. Medical screening, skills assessment, security background verification, and psychological stability confirmation. Those meeting criteria receive provisional citizenship and appropriate placement within our communities. And those who don't meet criteria? Eleanor asked directly. Rehabilitation options where appropriate, or relocation assistance to compatible territories, Harmon answered smoothly. We maintain humanitarian standards consistent with pre-collapse international agreements. The careful phrasing registered with everyone in Eleanor's group. Riley caught her eye, a subtle indication that the young tech specialist was documenting discrepancies between stated principles and observed realities. We'd like to understand your governance structure, Eleanor continued, historian's focus narrowing. On core questions, you've referenced constitutional principles and democratic processes. How specifically are those implemented within a crisis governance framework? Something flickered across Harmon's expression, a momentary recalibration. The Constitutional Continuity Protocol established emergency implementation of core democratic principles while suspending certain procedural elements during the stabilization phase. Regional governance councils maintain civilian oversight of security operations, with scheduled transitions toward full representative processes as stability metrics are achieved. The answer contained precisely the bureaucratic language Eleanor had anticipated, technically accurate perhaps, but designed to obscure rather than clarify the actual power structures operating within this society. We've observed numerous security checkpoints, but limited evidence of civilian governance, Marcus noted, supporting Eleanor's line of inquiry. What's the current ratio of military to civilian authority in operational decisions? An insightful question, Mr. Hale, Harmon acknowledged. The Integrated Security Directive maintains civilian oversight through council representation, while delegating tactical implementation to professional security services. This balance has proven effective in maintaining stability while preserving core values. Again, the answer revealed more in its structure than its content, the emphasis on stability and effective implementation rather than legitimacy or representation. Eleanor's historical pattern recognition continued assembling a disturbing picture, not the democratic haven they had sought, but something more complex, a functioning authoritarian system with democratic language but centralized control. Their tour continued through increasingly impressive facilities, power generation stations utilizing renewable technologies, medical centers with equipment Eleanor hadn't seen since before the collapse, agricultural operations with advanced irrigation systems, and what appeared to be genetically optimized crops. You've maintained technological development despite the collapse, Zoe observed, as they were shown a manufacturing center producing standardized components. Most regions we've traversed have regressed to pre-industrial methods where petroleum-based supply chains failed, Technological continuity was a core preservation objective, Officer Rodriguez explained. Key research and development personnel were designated essential knowledge assets and secured during the initial crisis phase. The clinical terminology, essential knowledge assets rather than scientists or engineers, further reinforced the system's bureaucratic nature. Eleanor noted how consistently they avoided humanizing language when discussing their operations and processes. By late afternoon, they reached what Harmon described as a regional administration center, a complex of buildings surrounding a former university campus, repurposed with visible security enhancements. Here, they were assigned individual quarters described as transitional accommodation, while their integration assessment was conducted. Once alone in their assigned space, Eleanor's group immediately implemented security protocols, checking for surveillance devices. Several were located and neutralized by Riley, establishing secure communication methods and creating contingency plans should separation be attempted. Assessment? Eleanor asked once they had established reasonable privacy. Advanced technological capacity beyond anything we've encountered, David reported first. Their infrastructure isn't just preserved, it's evolved. I observed manufacturing capabilities that might exceed pre-collapse standards in efficiency, particularly their synthetic fuel production. Medical facilities similarly advanced, Zoe added. The equipment I saw would enable everything from complex surgery to vaccine production. Population health management on a scale that would require extensive data systems. Their security protocols are sophisticated but concerning, Marcus continued. I counted at least 4 distinct security services with different insignia and command structures. Classic compartmentalization technique for preventing coordination between enforcement branches. Communication systems extensively monitored, Riley confirmed. The integration facility transmits continuous data to multiple secured locations, biometric scanning at every checkpoint, feeding into centralized databases. And the population seems compliant, Samir observed. Not fearful exactly, but exhibiting behavioral patterns consistent with extensive conditioning. Orderly, efficient, purpose-driven, but limited spontaneous interaction. Eleanor integrated these observations with her historical analysis. This isn't a democratic revival, she concluded. It's a technocratic authoritarian system using constitutional language as legitimization. Effective, certainly, but built on control rather than consent. Is that worse than what we've seen elsewhere? David challenged gently. The brigade executes dissenters. Independent communities struggle with basic survival. Here, people have security, medical care, functioning infrastructure. The question cut to the heart of their moral dilemma. The choice between imperfect security and principled chaos. Eleanor considered David's perspective with genuine openness rather than academic dismissal. It may represent a necessary transitional phase, she acknowledged. Historical patterns suggest societies often embrace authoritarian stability after collapse before evolving toward greater freedoms. The question becomes whether this system contains the mechanisms for that evolution or is designed to perpetuate control indefinitely. And our immediate decision, Zoe prompted. They'll expect commitments from us regarding integration or departure. The group fell silent, weighing options with the gravity of people who understood that some choices couldn't be unmade. Remain and potentially serve a system built on controlled population management. Attempt to leave and risk being classified as security threats. Or something else entirely. Riley broke the silence with unexpected intensity. There's a third option we haven't discussed. All eyes turned to her. I've been analyzing their communications infrastructure since arrival. Their systems are advanced, but not impenetrable. With access to their central data repositories, we could potentially expose the actual nature of this governance system to both their population and the territories beyond. Information warfare, Marcus translated, tactical mind immediately grasping the implications. Truth dissemination, Eleanor corrected gently. If this system maintains control, partly through information management and selective disclosure, transparency could be a catalyst for organic reform. The audacity of the suggestion momentarily stunned the group. After years of focusing on mere survival, they were contemplating an action that might influence the future governance of millions. The technical aspects are challenging, but feasible, Riley continued, energy building as she outlined possibilities. Their systems show architectural similarities to pre-collapse federal networks I studied during my scholarship program. With physical access to certain administrative terminals and approximately 72 hours of preparation, I could potentially create an information distribution protocol that would bypass their hierarchical controls. What exactly would we be distributing? Samir asked practically. Evidence of their actual governance structures, decision protocols, population classification systems, Riley explained. Based on what I've observed in their external communications, there's likely significant discrepancy between the constitutional principles they reference and their actual operational directives. Eleanor considered the historian's ethical obligation to truth against the pragmatic realities of their situation. This would classify us as active threats to their system, she noted. The response would be immediate and potentially lethal. Correct, Marcus confirmed, already analyzing potential. Security responses. We would need extraction capabilities and secure movement corridors to territories beyond their control, assuming such territories exist. They exist, Riley asserted with unexpected conviction. I've detected communications from genuine independent community, networks to the west, fragmented but actual grassroots governance, not top-down systems with democratic terminology. The possibility rekindled the hope that had driven their northern journey, that somewhere Americans had rebuilt based on actual democratic principles rather than controlled stability. If such communities existed, exposing the true nature of the Northern Territories might prevent their eventual absorption into this authoritarian system. We need more information before deciding, Eleanor determined. Tomorrow they'll begin our integration assessment. That gives us access to additional facilities, personnel, and systems. We gather intelligence, assess the full nature of this governance system, and identify whether it contains the potential for organic reform or represents permanent authoritarian control disguised as constitutional continuity. The group nodded agreement, falling into their familiar pattern of distributed responsibility. Marcus and Samir would analyze security systems and potential extraction routes. Riley would evaluate technical vulnerabilities in their information architecture. Zoe would engage medical personnel to assess population health management practices. David would examine infrastructure systems for evidence of control mechanisms. Eleanor would focus on identifying the actual power structures operating beneath the constitutional language. As night settled over the administration complex, Eleanor stood at the window of their accommodation, observing the brigade leadership share origins in the same pre-collapse contingency protocols. Different implementation approaches, but coordinated at strategic levels. Cold certainty settled in Eleanor's stomach. Controlled opposition, she murmured. Different. Governance models containing the fractured population within managed boundaries. Worse, Marcus continued grimly. They're preparing for Phase 3 implementation, consolidation of controlled territories under unified governance. Brigade territories will be pacified using northern technological superiority, then absorbed into the centralized system. Timeline? Operations. Commencing within 72 hours, Riley has confirmed through their secure networks. Northern forces are already mobilizing. Eleanor processed the implications rapidly. The chaotic ideological conflict they had navigated wasn't resolving toward either democratic revival or authoritarian dominance. It was culminating in planned absorption into a technocratic system that had orchestrated the controlled burning of democratic institutions all along. "Gather at secondary rendezvous point in 3 hours," she instructed. "Riley's information distribution option is now primary. We need to expose this before implementation begins." Returning to Director Walsh with practiced composure, Eleanor continued her assessment process while extracting crucial information about the Northern Territory's historical narrative management systems, particularly their methods for information distribution and population messaging. Each detail potentially vital for Riley's planned intervention. 3 hours later, Eleanor's group reconvened in a maintenance area Riley had identified as having minimal surveillance. Each brought critical intelligence gathered during their assessment process. "Population classification systems confirmed," Zoe reported first. "Medical evaluation includes neurological profiling for social compatibility and directive receptivity. Those showing independent cognitive patterns receive chemical management protocols disguised as health optimization. Infrastructure systems, designed for population control as much as functionality," David added. "Water, power, transportation, all modular and capable of sector-specific termination for containment protocols. Multiple security services with distinct protocols but unified command structure," Marcus confirmed. "Designed to create illusion of separation while preventing coordinated resistance." Samir completed the assessment. "Resource distribution highly stratified despite public messaging about equitable allocation. Essential personnel receive significantly enhanced provisions, with classification determined by system value rather than democratic processes." Riley had been uncharacteristically quiet, focused on a portable terminal she'd managed to access during her technical assessment. Now she looked up, expression tense but determined. "I've identified their primary information. Architecture vulnerabilities," she reported. "Their systems are sophisticated but maintain certain pre-collapse structural elements I recognize from federal cybersecurity protocols. With physical access to a Level 3 administrative terminal, I could potentially deploy an information distribution package throughout their networks." "Contents," Eleanor prompted. "Evidence of the actual governance structure, Phase 3 implementation plans, coordination with brigade leadership, population classification and control systems. Everything we've discovered distributed simultaneously to all information access points within their territory." The audacity of the plan momentarily silenced the group. After years focused on mere survival, they were contemplating an action with potential consequences for millions across the former United States. Once initiated, we'd have approximately 42 minutes before security protocols could isolate and terminate the distribution, Riley continued. "During that window, their entire population would receive unfiltered information about the system they actually live within. And then," Marcus asked, tactical mind assessing consequences. Riley's expression hardened. "Then we'd be classified as maximum priority security threats and hunted accordingly. We would need extraction capabilities beyond anything we've attempted." Samir noted, already mentally calculating resource requirements. "And somewhere to extract to," Zoe added. "If Northern Territories and brigade forces are coordinating, where exactly would we go?" Riley turned her terminal, displaying a mapped communication network. "I've confirmed transmissions from actual independent communities here, here, and here." She indicated regions to the northwest. "Genuine grassroots governance, not controlled opposition. If we could reach these territories with evidence of the Northern Territories' true nature and imminent consolidation. Plans, orderly movements of personnel below. Lights functioned consistently, no brownouts or rationing evident. People moved with purpose rather than the desperate scavenging she'd witnessed in fractured territories. Children, actual children in groups, walked, with educational materials suggesting functioning schools. The contrast with the brutal chaos of the RABID states was stark and undeniable. Yet Eleanor found herself questioning whether mere functioning was sufficient measure of a society's worth. The historian in her recalled how many oppressive systems throughout history had provided stability, security, even prosperity, while systematically undermining the human dignity and self-determination that formed the foundation of actual democratic governance. Tomorrow would begin their most complex mission yet, not just surviving the fractured landscape of post-collapse America, but potentially shaping what would emerge from its ashes. Morning brought the anticipated integration assessment, a comprehensive evaluation process separated into specialized components. As planned, Eleanor's group was divided among different assessment centers, each gathering critical intelligence about the Northern Territory's true operational nature. Eleanor found herself directed to what they called the historical continuity division, a facility that immediately triggered both her professional interest and deepening concern. Housed in a repurposed university building, it contained extensive archives of pre-collapse materials alongside what appeared to be an active historical narrative construction operation. Professor Reeves, a middle-aged woman with the distinctive insignia of the division's leadership, greeted her. "I'm Director Abigail Walsh. Your background makes you uniquely valuable to our historical preservation efforts. This assessment will determine optimal placement within our division." Walsh led Eleanor through climate-controlled rooms, housing physical documents, digital archives, and what appeared to be a content production facility where personnel created educational materials. The scale and sophistication impressed even Eleanor's academic standards, far beyond the limited preservation efforts she'd attempted in her journal. "You've maintained comprehensive historical archives," she observed, carefully measuring her response. "Most regions we've traversed have lost significant historical context during the collapse." Historical continuity was designated a Level 1 preservation priority, Walsh explained with evident pride. When societal breakdown reached critical thresholds, specialized teams secured archival materials and essential historical personnel from vulnerable institutions. "For what purpose?" Eleanor asked directly. "Pure preservation, or something more?" "Applied," Walsh's expression shifted subtly. "Recognition of a fellow professional who understood the political implications of historical narrative. Historical context provides essential frameworks for societal reconstruction," she replied. "Our division maintains contextual continuity while implementing adaptive narrative frameworks appropriate to current governance requirements." The careful phrasing confirmed Eleanor's suspicions. This wasn't preservation for knowledge's sake. It was selective historical framing to support whatever governance system now controlled the Northern Territories. "Adaptive narrative frameworks," Eleanor repeated, historians' skepticism evident. "You mean controlling which historical patterns and precedents are emphasized to legitimize current authority structures?" Instead of denial, Walsh offered a colleague's candor. "History has always served governance, Professor. You know this as well as I do. The only question is whether it serves constructive or destructive ends." She gestured toward a wall displaying images of brigade atrocities. "Would you prefer the historical narratives emerging in the RABID states, where selective interpretation justifies ideological purges and authoritarian brutality?" The false binary struck Eleanor as precisely the rhetorical technique she would expect from sophisticated propagandists. "Those aren't the only options," she countered. "Historical truth can serve democratic revival without selective framing, a luxury of stable societies," Walsh dismissed. During reconstruction phases, historical narrative must support stability imperatives. Surely your research on post-collapse civilizations demonstrated this pattern. Before Eleanor could respond, her secured communication device vibrated, the signal that another team member had urgent information. She excused herself to what appeared to be a restroom facility, confirming it was surveillance-free using Riley's detection techniques. Eleanor. Marcus's voice came through their encrypted channel. Security Assessment Division has confirmed our suspicions. Northern Territories, and we might prevent complete absorption of the remaining independent regions. Eleanor completed the thought. The historian recognized the pattern from countless revolutionary movements throughout history. Information as the catalyst for resistance against sophisticated oppression. The Level 3 terminal access is the critical vulnerability, Marcus assessed, already analyzing options. Where are these terminals located? Central Administration Complex, Riley answered. Heavily secured, restricted personnel access, multiple verification protocols, which we now have, Eleanor realized. Our integration assessment provides temporary access credentials to various administrative sectors. Combined with the intelligence we've gathered about security protocols, we could potentially create a brief access window, Marcus confirmed. High risk, minimal margin for error, but technically feasible. The group fell silent, each weighing the implications of what they were considering. This wasn't just another survival decision. It was a conscious choice to oppose a system far more powerful than themselves, with minimal chance of personal survival, regardless of outcome. We should vote, Eleanor suggested, maintaining their established decision protocol despite the stakes. The humanitarian imperative seems clear, Zoe spoke first. A system built on neurological classification and chemical management of non-compliant individuals violates basic medical ethics. I support intervention. The infrastructure I've observed is designed for population control first, human flourishing second, David added. Technical capabilities used for suppression rather than empowerment. I support intervention. Their resource allocation systems maintain artificial scarcity to ensure dependency, Samir continued. Genuine abundance is possible, but deliberately restricted for control purposes. I support intervention. Security structures designed to prevent precisely the kind of democratic accountability they claim to uphold, Marcus assessed. Systems that cannot be reformed from within require external catalysts. I support intervention, technical capabilities that could serve human liberation used instead for sophisticated oppression, Riley concluded. Information asymmetry as the foundation of unjust power. I support intervention. All eyes turned to Eleanor, the historian whose perspective had guided their journey from simple survival to purposeful resistance. She felt the weight of centuries of similar moments when small groups had altered the trajectory of civilization through courage rather than power. Throughout history, systems that fear transparency have seldom served human dignity, she stated simply. I support intervention. The decision made, they turned to tactical planning with the focused efficiency of people who had navigated apocalypse together. Riley outlined the technical requirements for the information distribution package. Marcus and Samir mapped potential access and extraction routes. David identified infrastructure vulnerabilities they could exploit for distraction or cover. Zoe prepared medical contingencies for inevitable injuries. Eleanor found herself unexpectedly calm as 0 hour approached. The historian had become a revolutionary through no grand design, but through incremental moral choices, leading inexorably to this moment. Her academic knowledge of historical resistance movements now translated into practical guidance as they finalized their approach. The most effective revolutions aren't those that merely destroy existing systems, she reminded the group during their final preparation. They're those that reveal truths already suspected by the population, catalyzing organic resistance rather than imposing external change. As darkness fell over the administration complex, they moved into position, utilizing their assessment credentials to navigate security checkpoints while maintaining the appearance of compliant integration candidates. Riley had identified a maintenance access corridor leading to the central administration level, where the critical terminals were located, a route with minimal surveillance designed for emergency technical access. Security rotation in 30 seconds, Marcus reported through their encrypted channel. Corridor will be clear for approximately 90 seconds. Eleanor felt adrenaline sharpen her senses as they waited in a service alcove. Beside her, Riley clutched the specialized device she'd constructed to deploy the information package once connected to the administrative systems. David and Samir had positioned themselves at strategic points to create technical disruptions if needed, while Zoe prepared their medical extraction supplies in a maintenance vehicle they'd secured for emergency departure. Now, Marcus signaled, and they moved with practiced coordination into the maintenance corridor. Eleanor's historian's mind briefly noted the strange symmetry. Knowledge preservation specialists now using their expertise to shatter carefully constructed historical narratives. The administrative level emerged before them, a glass-walled command center, filled with technical personnel monitoring the vast information systems controlling the Northern Territories. Riley immediately identified the Level 3 terminal access point, a separated workspace with additional security features. "Verification protocols require authorized personnel," she whispered. "The credentials we acquired from the assessment process will trigger secondary verification." Eleanor nodded toward the solution they'd identified during planning. Medical emergency diversion. On cue, Zoe activated their contingency, a simulated medical emergency alert indicating contamination risk in adjacent administrative sectors. The response was immediate. Security protocols initiated containment procedures, temporarily overriding normal verification requirements for essential technical personnel. Marcus approached the security station with the confident authority of someone responding to crisis protocols. "Technical containment response," he stated, displaying the credentials they'd modified. "Level 3 systems assessment required for contamination isolation." The security officer hesitated briefly before emergency procedures overrode standard verification. "Proceed to containment stations. Authorization temporary during Protocol 7 implementation." They moved quickly through the checkpoint, entering the restricted area containing the Level 3 terminals. Riley immediately located the primary access point, connecting her device while Eleanor and Marcus maintained watchful positions. "System accepting initial verification," Riley reported tensely. "Deploying bypass protocols, accessing central distribution architecture, preparing information package." Eleanor watched the young tech specialist work with extraordinary focus, fingers moving across interfaces with practiced precision. On surrounding monitors, she could see the Northern Territories command information flowing, surveillance data, resource allocation directives, population management protocols. The sophisticated machinery of control operating with clinical efficiency. "Package ready for deployment," Riley announced, looking up with uncharacteristic uncertainty. "Once initiated, there's no recall capability. All information points will receive simultaneous distribution." Eleanor met her gaze steadily. "Truth against power, the oldest revolution." Riley nodded once, then activated the deployment sequence. For a moment, nothing visible happened. Then the surrounding monitors flickered briefly before displaying new content. The information package had begun distribution throughout the Northern Territories communications network. "Distribution initiated," Riley confirmed. "Estimated 47 minutes before isolation protocols can terminate the feed. Primary extraction route remains viable." They moved with renewed urgency, disconnecting Riley's device and proceeding toward their planned exit route. The alarm came. Sooner than anticipated, a high-priority security alert triggering throughout the complex. System integrity breach detected. All personnel implement security protocol Epsilon. This is not a drill. They've traced the source faster than estimated, Marcus assessed as they increased pace. Primary extraction route likely compromised. Secondary route through infrastructure tunnels, David directed through their communication channel. Eastern access, point in maintenance sector 7. They altered course, moving through increasingly crowded corridors as personnel responded to security protocols. Eleanor caught glimpses of monitor screens throughout the facility, all displaying portions of the information package Riley had deployed. The truth about the Northern Territory's governance system, the planned absorption of brigade territories, the population classification protocols, all flowing unfiltered to every information access point within their jurisdiction. Security forces, converging on our position, Samir warned through communications. Alternate approach required. Eleanor processed their options with the clarity of immediate danger. Separation protocol, she decided. Individual extraction paths converging at secondary rendezvous point. The group immediately implemented their contingency, separating into individual movement patterns that would complicate security response while maintaining coordinated extraction. Eleanor found herself moving alone through service corridors, utilizing the facility maps they had memorized during planning. She encountered the first security response team at a junction point. 3 officers in tactical gear, moving with practiced precision. Without hesitation, she implemented the diversion they had prepared, activating a localized fire suppression system that immediately filled the corridor with obscuring vapor, while triggering secondary alerts that would further complicate security coordination. The historian who had once analyzed conflicts from academic distance now moved through chaos she had helped create, her theoretical knowledge translated into survival instinct. Each junction, each security checkpoint, each moment of exposure required immediate calculation and decisive action. Eleanor reached the infrastructure access tunnel David had identified, finding Zoe already waiting with medical supplies prepared. "Riley and Marcus?" she asked immediately. "En route through alternate paths," Zoe reported. "Samir and David securing transport at extraction point." Minutes stretched with excruciating tension as they waited in the dimly lit tunnel. Eleanor's injured leg throbbed with renewed pain, the days of exertion taking their toll, despite Zoe's medical interventions. Above them, alerts continued blaring as the Northern Territory's command structure responded to their information breach. Riley arrived next, breathless but triumphant. "Distribution continuing past estimated termination window," she reported. "They're attempting system isolation but encountering cascading access points faster than their protocols can contain." Marcus joined them last, bearing evidence of physical confrontation, a bloodied sleeve and tactical focus that suggested he had encountered more direct resistance. "Security forces implementing full facility lockdown," he reported tersely. "We have approximately 12 minutes before comprehensive containment protocols activate." They moved through the infrastructure tunnels with renewed urgency, following David's mapped route toward their extraction point. Eleanor found herself cataloging sensory details with historian's precision, the echoing alerts above, the measured breaths of her companions, the distinctive smell of maintenance tunnels, identical across collapsed civilization. Small constants in a world transformed. The extraction point emerged ahead, a maintenance bay where David and Samir had secured their transport vehicle. They boarded quickly, David immediately activating the engine while Samir distributed the weapons they had concealed for emergency extraction. Northern Territory security forces mobilizing throughout the region, Marcus reported, monitoring communications. Full containment protocols implemented, all checkpoints actively seeking our descriptions. "And the information distribution?" Eleanor asked, the revolutionaries' concern for impact overriding immediate survival considerations. Riley checked her monitoring device, a rare smile crossing her face. Still flowing. They've failed to isolate approximately 60% of distribution nodes. Information has reached all major population centers and continues propagating through secondary networks. Outside their vehicle, the ordered calm of the Northern Territories had transformed. Personnel moved with urgent purpose rather than controlled. Efficiency. Security forces deployed in tactical formations, and on public information screens visible through the complex windows, Eleanor could see the evidence of their intervention, the truth about the governance system displayed for all citizens to witness. "What happens now?" Zoe asked quietly, as their vehicle approached the first security checkpoint, the moment their theoretical revolution would encounter practical resistance. Eleanor thought of all the historical movements she had studied, those that succeeded and those that failed, those remembered and those forgotten. "Truth against power is never wasted," she answered, "even if we don't witness the outcome." The checkpoint loomed ahead, heavily armed security forces checking all departing vehicles with heightened scrutiny. Their moment of reckoning had arrived. The historians, the soldiers, the healers, the builders, the providers who had survived. The RABID states now facing the consequences of choosing principle over pragmatism. 3 months after their desperate escape from the Northern Territories, Eleanor stood atop a windswept ridge overlooking what locals called New Geneva, a community of approximately 12,000 people nestled in a valley that straddled what had once been the Minnesota-Canadian border. Unlike the rigid order of the Northern Territories or the chaotic violence of Brigade territories, this settlement exhibited the organic messiness of genuine democracy. The journey here had tested them beyond anything they'd previously endured. Their escape from the Northern Territories had succeeded through a combination of Riley's electronic countermeasures, Marcus's tactical expertise, and unexpected assistance from Northern Territory citizens who had received their information distribution and chosen towed their flight. But the cost had been high. Samir had been separated during their crossing of the security perimeter, his status still unknown despite their persistent efforts to locate him. David suffered injuries during a pursuit engagement that left him with permanent mobility limitations. All of them carried new scars, both physical and psychological. Yet something profound had changed in the territories they traversed. The information package Riley had distributed had shattered the Northern Territories' carefully maintained narrative. Reports filtered through communication networks of public demonstrations, security force defections, and governance reforms demanded by citizens who now understood the true nature of the system controlling them. More significantly, independent communities that had received warning of the planned Phase 3 consolidation had formed mutual defense networks, establishing communication channels and resource-sharing agreements that complicated the Northern Territories' absorption. "Strategy. You started something," Marcus observed, joining Eleanor on the ridge. The former Marine had softened somewhat in recent weeks, the tactical pragmatist allowing space for cautious hope. "We revealed something," Eleanor corrected. The resistance was always there, waiting for confirmation of what Manny already suspected. Below them, New Geneva bustled with activity, town meetings in the Central Commons, children in actual schools, markets, where genuine exchange occurred without centralized control, imperfect, inefficient, sometimes chaotic, but undeniably alive with the messy reality of human self-determination. "Riley's report," Marcus asked. "Communications networks continuing to expand between independent communities," Eleanor confirmed. "The Northern Territories have suspended their consolidation operations, focusing instead on internal stability. Brigade territories experiencing increased defections as their connection to the Northern governance system becomes widely understood. Not victory," Marcus assessed realistically, "but opportunity." Eleanor nodded, historian's perspective balancing revolutionary hope with pragmatic understanding. Throughout human history, moments like these represented not endpoints, but critical junctures, opportunities for redirection rather than guaranteed outcomes. From the settlement below, figures approached. David walking with his supportive cane, Zoe carrying medical supplies for the community clinic she now helped operate. Riley, with her communications equipment, continually expanded through collaboration with other tech specialists who had escaped similar facilities. Eleanor watched them with profound affection. These people, once strangers united only by survival, had become something history books would struggle to categorize. Not quite family, not merely colleagues, but essential components of each other's humanity preserved through collapse. "What comes next, Professor?" Riley asked, as the group assembled on the ridge. Eleanor considered the fractured landscape stretching beyond their view, the rabid states slowly transforming as truth overcame manipulation, independent communities connecting, rather than isolating, genuine governance re-emerging from controlled chaos. "History isn't written by historians," she answered, placing her journal, the record of America's unraveling and potential rebirth, in the center of their circle. "It's written by those who act when action seems impossible." Across the former United States, in territories once consumed by ideology and fear, small fires of genuine democracy flickered, imperfect, vulnerable, but alive with possibility. And in that possibility, humanity found its edge not in systems or structures, but in the courage of those who chose truth over comfort, connection over division, and the difficult path of rebuilding rather than the seductive simplicity of rage.